Carl Rogers originated a popular approach to psychotherapy known initially as non-directive or client-centered therapy, which later came to be called person-centered therapy. This form of psychotherapy has generated an enormous amount of research and is widely used today in counseling situations. Rogers' personality theory, like Maslow's, is rooted in humanistic psychology, which Rogers made the framework for the patient-therapist relationship. Rogers did not develop his theory from experimental research conducted in laboratories, but rather from his experiences working with patients, or clients, as he preferred to call them. Rogers' view of the therapeutic situation tells us much about his view of human nature. Consider the phrase person-centered therapy. It tells us that the ability to change and improve personality is centered within the person. In other words, it is the person and not the therapist who directs such change. The therapist's role is to assist or facilitate the change. Rogers believed that we are rational beings ruled by a conscious perception of ourselves and our experiential world. He gave very little importance to unconscious forces or other Freudian explanations. He also rejected the notion that events from our past exert a controlling influence on our present behavior. Although he recognized that childhood experiences affect the way we perceive our environment and ourselves, Rogers insisted that current feelings and emotions have a greater impact on personality. We'll begin this lecture with a biography of Carl Rogers, and then we'll move on to look at some of the main tenets of person-centered therapy and how psychotherapy works using this approach. Rogers was vitally interested in the psychologically healthy person. He called this the fully functioning person, or the person of tomorrow, and we'll look at some of the characteristics of the person of tomorrow. We'll continue with a look at Rogers' philosophy of science. He believed that person-centered interviews, which rely on clients' self-reports, were of greater value than experimental methods. In his view, the more orthodox scientific approaches yielded less information on the nature of personality than did his clinical observations. We'll continue by taking a look at the Chicago studies. These studies, which were conducted a while ago, are still some of the best designed and most sophisticated of all investigations into the effectiveness of his approach. We'll continue by taking a look at some related research, and we'll conclude with a critique of Rogers and a look at his concept of humanity. Carl Rogers was born into a devoutly religious family in a Chicago suburb in 1902. He was the fourth of 6 children of devoutly religious parents. In order to avoid the temptations of a sinful life, the Rogers family moved to a nearby farm. In such an environment, Carl became interested in scientific farming and learned to appreciate the scientific method. He briefly attended a seminary in 1924 with the intention of becoming a minister. When he graduated from the University of Wisconsin, Rogers intended to become a minister, but he gave up that notion and completed a PhD in psychology from Columbia University in 1931. In 1940, after nearly a dozen years working as a clinician, he took a position at Ohio State University, and he published Client-Centered Therapy in 1951. Later, he held positions at the University of Chicago and the University of Wisconsin. In 1964, he moved to California, where he helped to found the Center for Studies of the Person. He died in 1987 at the age of 85. Rogers made some significant contributions, to say the least. His person-centered theory grew out of his experiences as a psychotherapist, and he was the first to record counseling sessions and carefully analyze them later to learn how therapists can best provide the necessary and sufficient conditions for change and growth. He was a pioneer and revolutionized counseling theory and practice. Some of his revolutionary ideas are that people are basically trustworthy, that they have a vast potential for understanding themselves and resolving their own problems without direct intervention by the therapist, and that they are capable of self-directed growth if they are involved in a special kind of therapeutic relationship. Rogers emphasized that the personal characteristics of the therapist and the quality of the therapeutic relationship are the crucial factors in determining whether or not there is a positive outcome. He built his theory on his experiences working with clients and called for empirical research to back up his approach and his theory. In his book on becoming a person, he provides data to support the three necessary and sufficient conditions: empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard. He was not comfortable with the notion of theory and preferred to help people. He thought theories were cold. He preferred to be working with others. Also, he felt that the therapist's knowledge of theory and techniques was really secondary to developing the therapeutic relationship, which provided the fertile ground for self-healing and self-directed growth. He never systematically reformulated his theory of personality, but he never said it was completed. He expected his model to change and grow and evolve. In fact, motivational enhancement therapy or motivational interviewing is based on his theory. Person-centered theory rests on two basic assumptions: the formative tendency that states that all matter, both organic and inorganic, tends to evolve from simpler to more complex forms, and the actualizing tendency, which suggests that all living things, including humans, tend to move toward completion or fulfillment of potentials. However, in order for people or plants or animals to become actualized, certain conditions must be present. For a human, these conditions include a relationship with another person who is genuine or congruent and who demonstrates complete acceptance and empathy for that person. Rogers said a sense of self or personal identity begins to emerge during infancy, and once established, it allows a person to strive toward self-actualization, which is a subsystem of the actualizing tendency we just mentioned. And it refers to the tendency to actualize the self as perceived in awareness. In other words, in developing a sense of identity, Rogers said the self has two subsystems: the self-concept, which includes all those aspects of one's identity that are perceived in awareness, and the ideal self, or our view of ourself as we would like it to be, or what we would aspire to be. Once formed, the self-concept tends to resist change, as people find change difficult, and gaps between it and the ideal self result in incongruence and various levels of psychopathology. The self-concept includes all aspects of one's identity as perceived in awareness. Now, these perceptions are not always accurate. The self-concept is not the same as the organismic self. The organismic self is the drive toward self-actualization we are born with. It also refers to what is going on within the person that he or she is aware of. The text uses the example of the stomach as being part of the organismic self, but unless there is a problem, such as a need for Prilosec, it's not part of the self-concept. I wanted to reinforce this notion of congruence, which is an important concept in this theory. On the left, you'll see a diagram indicating an incongruent individual, and on the right, a congruent person. On the left, you'll see the self-image is different from the ideal self in that there is only a little overlap, and here self-actualization will be difficult. On the right, the congruent person, you will see the self-image is more similar to the ideal self. In other words, there is more overlap or agreement or compatibility between the self-image and the ideal self. And this person can more easily self-actualize. People are aware of both their self-concept and their ideal self, although awareness need not be accurate. For example, people may have an inflated view of their ideal self, but only a vague sense of their self-concept. Rogers saw people as having experiences on three levels of awareness. First, those that are symbolized below the threshold of awareness and are ignored, denied, or not allowed into the self-concept. Secondly, those that are distorted or reshaped to fit into an existing self-concept, and third, those that are consistent with the self-concept and thus are accurately symbolized and freely admitted to the self-structure. Any experience not consistent with the self-concept, even positive experiences, will be distorted or denied. Because of the discrepancy between the self-concept and the ideal self, positive experiences can be denied. The two basic human needs are maintenance and enhancement, but people also need positive regard and self-regard. Maintenance needs include those for food, air, and safety, but they also include our tendency to resist change and to maintain our self-concept as it is. Enhancement needs include needs to grow and to realize one's full human potential. As awareness of self emerges, an infant begins to receive positive regard from another person, that is, to be loved or accepted. People naturally value those experiences that satisfy their needs for positive regard. But unfortunately, this value sometimes becomes more powerful than the reward they receive for meeting their organismic needs. This sets up the condition of incongruence, which is experienced when basic organismic needs or bodily needs are denied or distorted in favor of needs to be loved or accepted. As a result of experiences with positive regard, people develop the need for self-regard, which they acquire only after they perceive that someone who cares for them and values them is in their lives. Once established, however, self-regard becomes autonomous and no longer dependent on another person's continuous positive evaluation. Rogers believed that people are motivated by an innate tendency to actualize, maintain, and enhance the self. The process involves struggle and pain. For example, when children take their first steps, they may fall and hurt themselves. Although it would be less painful to remain in the crawling stage, most children persist. They may fall again and cry, but they persevere despite the pain, because the tendency to actualize is stronger than the urge to regress simply because the growth process is difficult. Now, along life's way, there may be barriers to psychological health. The first one is conditions of worth. Most people are not unconditionally accepted. Instead, they receive conditions of worth. That is, they feel that they are loved and accepted only when and if they meet the conditions set by others. Next involves incongruence, when the organismic self, which includes an organismic valuing process, a process by which we judge experiences in terms of their value for fostering or hindering our actual growth and actualization. When the organismic self and the self-concept are at variance with one another, a person may experience incongruence, anxiety, threat, defensiveness, and even disorganization. The greater the incongruence, the more vulnerable that person becomes. Anxiety exists whenever the person becomes dimly aware of the discrepancy between the organismic experience and self-concept, whereas threat is experienced whenever the person becomes more clearly aware of this incongruence. To prevent incongruence, people react with defensiveness, typically in the forms of distortion and denial. With distortion, people misinterpret an experience so that it fits into their self-concept. With denial, people refuse to allow the experience into awareness. When people's defenses fail to operate properly, their behavior becomes disorganized or even psychotic. For person-centered psychotherapy to be effective, some conditions are necessary. Rogers called them the necessary and sufficient conditions for therapeutic growth. The first is counselor congruence, or a therapist whose organismic experiences are matched by awareness and by the ability and willingness to openly express these feelings. Congruence is more basic than the other two conditions because it is a relatively stable characteristic of the therapist, whereas the other two conditions are unique to each specific therapeutic relationship. Unconditional positive regard exists when the therapist accepts and prizes the client without conditions or qualifications. Empathic listening is the ability of the therapist to sense the feeling of a client and also to communicate these perceptions so that the client knows that another person has entered into his or her world of feelings without prejudice, projection, or evaluation. To accomplish this, Rogers stressed using reflection and other ways of being with the client. Accurate empathic understanding of the client is crucial, meaning that the therapist will sense the client's feelings as if they were his or her own without getting lost in those feelings. The theoretical explanation for change is the therapist provides an example within the relationship that the other person is unconditionally accepted, and the other person realizes, maybe for the first time, that he or she is lovable. So now they're able to love themselves and give themselves unconditional positive regard. They can have empathy for themselves. Eventually, they possess the same three characteristics as any effective therapist. So, they can become their own therapist. If people receive the three necessary and sufficient conditions for psychological health, then they will grow toward becoming the fully functioning person, or the person of tomorrow. Rogers listed 7 characteristics of the person of tomorrow. First, these people would be more adaptable and more flexible in their thinking. Second, they would be open to their experiences, accurately symbolizing them in awareness rather than denying or distorting them. Persons of tomorrow would listen to themselves and hear their joy, anger, discouragement, fear, and tenderness. A third characteristic would be a tendency to live fully in the moment, experiencing a constant state of fluidity and change. They would be able to see each experience with a new freshness and appreciate it fully in the present moment. Rogers referred to this tendency to live in the moment as existential living. Fourth, persons of tomorrow would remain confident of their own ability to experience harmonious relations with others. They would feel no need to be liked or loved by everyone because they would know that they are unconditionally prized and accepted by someone. Fifth, they would be more integrated, more whole, with no artificial boundary between conscious processes and unconscious ones. Because they would be able to accurately symbolize all their experiences in awareness, they would see clearly the difference between what is and what should be. Sixth, persons of tomorrow would have a basic trust of human nature. They would experience anger, frustration, depression, and other negative emotions, but they would be able to express rather than repress these feelings. Finally, because persons of tomorrow are open to all their experiences, they would enjoy a greater richness in life than do other people. They would live in the present and thus participate more richly in the ongoing moment. Rogers' philosophy of science can be summarized as follows. Science begins and ends with subjective experience. Scientists must be involved with the phenomena being studied. Intuitive scientists perceive patterns among phenomena, and scientists communicate findings, but this communication is subjective. Rogers agreed with Maslow that scientists must care about the phenomena they study, and that psychologists should limit their objectivity and precision to their methodology, not to the creation of hypotheses or to the communication of research findings. When he taught at the University of Chicago and again at the University of Wisconsin, Rogers, along with colleagues and graduate students, conducted an experimental investigation on the effectiveness of client-centered therapy. These studies, though now old, remain as some of the best designed and most sophisticated of all such investigations. The study at the University of Chicago tested 4 broad hypotheses. As a consequence of therapy, 1, clients will become more aware of their feelings and experiences. 2, the gap between the real self and the ideal self will lessen. 3, clients' behavior will become more socialized. And 4, clients will become both more self-accepting and more accepting of others. The methodology of these studies used the Q-sort technique to measure change from the client's point of view and to test the hypotheses. Q-sort was the dependent variable. For example, in one study, there were 100 self-reference statements printed on 3x5 cards. An example of a statement would be, "I'm a good person." Now, participants were asked to sort these statements into piles. And at one point, there were 9 piles representing a continuum ranging from, say, on the one end, statements that were most like me, and on the other end, the piles represented statements that were least like me. The Q sort was used to measure if people's concepts of themselves or others changed as a result of treatment. The participants were adults who sought therapy at the University of Chicago Counseling Center. The findings of the Chicago studies showed that the therapy group, but not the weight group, showed a lessening of the gap between real self and ideal self. They also found that clients who improved during therapy showed changes in social behavior, as reported by their friends. Compared to the normal control group, clients who had undergone client-centered therapy showed greater congruence and higher emotional maturity. This still showed up at 6 and 12 months follow-up. Although client-centered therapy was successful in changing clients, it was not successful in bringing them to the level of the fully functioning persons, or even to the level of normal psychological health. Becoming the person of tomorrow is difficult. More recently, other researchers have investigated Rogers' facilitative conditions. In the 1980s, E. Torrey Higgins developed a version of Rogers' model called self-discrepancy theory. Higgins hypothesized that individuals with high levels of self-discrepancy were most likely to experience high levels of negative affect in their lives, such as anxiety and depression. Ann Phillips and Paul Silva predicted that high self-awareness of self-discrepancies is related to negative emotions. In other words, awareness of discrepancies would be greatest when people are more self-aware or self-focused. Their hypothesis was supported by their findings when they compared participants completing their questionnaires in front of a mirror to participants without a mirror. Other researchers have found that college students with a high discrepancy between real and ideal self-perceptions tended to drink more alcohol in a controlled setting. In general, these results supported Rogers' notion that people whose ideal self is at variance with their real self may turn to unhealthy behaviors as a means of coping with this discrepancy. As part of his theory, Rogers proposed that we all have an organismic valuing process, or OVP, a natural instinct guiding us toward the most fulfilling pursuits. Sheldon and colleagues explored the existence of an OVP in college students. Their hypothesis that if people have an OVP, over time they will rate more inherently fulfilling goals as more desirable than materialistic goals was supported by their findings. Swartz and Waterman found the organismic valuing process directs people toward fulfilling pursuits, just as Rogers would have predicted. Rogers' person-centered theory is one of the most carefully constructed of all personality theories, and it meets quite well each of the 6 criteria of a useful theory. Rogers' theory is very high on practicality and internal consistency, high on falsifiability, parsimony, and organizing knowledge, and moderate on generating research. In his concept of humanity, Rogers believed that humans have the capacity to change and grow, provided that certain necessary and sufficient conditions are present. Therefore, his theory rates very high on optimism. In addition, it rates high on free choice, teleology, conscious motivation, social influences, and the uniqueness of the individual.